Hey folks, and welcome back. Today we're going to be dealing with something that we really only get to do once a year, and that is converting Christmas village buildings into D&D terrain. The best way to get these cheaply, if you can manage it, is to find them at a thrift store or a second-hand shop. There you can usually get them for $5 or $10, and that gets you something that looks like this. Now, it takes a little bit of work, and you have to have sort of a concept that you want to work with, but these are really fun and pretty easy to turn into great tabletop terrain. Let's jump in. As you can see, there are some difficulties in working with buildings like these. The Christmas decorations they're covered in, the holes for lighting systems, and the piles of snow being right at the top of the list. Now, some of these decorations on the restaurant building are just hot glued into place, so I'm going to just pry those off before I really get started. For everything else, that's where having a strong concept you can work with comes into play. I've decided I want these buildings to look abandoned and like they're being reclaimed by the earth. Buildings in some swamp town that suffered a catastrophe and are now being swallowed up by their boggy surroundings. That's for a few reasons. One is that painting these buildings in darker tones is one of the easiest ways to make them look less identifiable as Christmas buildings, which are always jolly and bright. The other is that this kind of backstory gives us a lot to work with as far as adding details to the build. I primed the buildings in a nice dark gray to get rid of those oversaturated colors, and then it's time to start adding some details and covering up problem areas. I've decided that the restaurant is going to get turned into a long-forgotten swamp town tavern, and the grocery store is going to stay just that, a grocer or general store. To cover up the hole in the back of the tavern, I've decided that it needs a loading bay door, a place that workers can take deliveries in the back without disturbing customers. So I carved that out of some thin pink foam and used the old wire brush trick to texture it and a ballpoint pen to define the planks. Super easy stuff. I also built a few cross supports made of this foam wood. When you're doing something like this and it's going to be seen from the top and sides as well, make sure to also texture those areas and to continue the definition of the planks onto the top and bottom. That kind of thing is easy to miss, but it really brings your builds up to the next level. I use the exact same techniques to build some simple wood planks to disguise the hole in the back of the grocer. Again, I want these places to look damaged and abandoned, like they've really been through hell, so this gets turned into a hole in the actual wall of the building that's just been haphazardly boarded over. I use a very similar method again for covering up the wreath on the front of the building. The shop front windows have long since been busted out and boarded over. And so I just take a foam block and carve a little spot for that wreath to nestle into with a craft knife. Then I texture the front in the exact same way as the last few pieces and just slide it into place. Having such a strong concept, an abandoned and devastated swamp town, is part of what makes it easy to get creative in covering these up. Sometimes when you're looking to make terrain without blowing your whole budget, the best thing you can do is to work conceptually with what you have. Get creative and pick methods and ideas that will let you work with the things you have to hand. Now that all of my foam wood pieces are in place, I take a toothpick and add some nail holes to the ends of all of the boards across all of the pieces. It's easiest to just do this once, all together, once everything is dry. Always work in batches like that when you can. It saves time. And finally, I'm going to base coat the foam in gray paint to match the prime. You could Mod Podge first if you want to, but it's really not necessary in this case. This is just to get a first coat of paint on here and to make everything the same undercoat color to start with. While that dries, I got out my bits box and decided to see what I could do to add to these builds. The tavern ended up getting a nice hanging sign out front, as well as a hoist in the back over the loading bay doors to help with those heavy casks of ale. And the grocer got a second, more ramshackle looking chimney. This step isn't strictly necessary, but adding a few extra details is fun, and also helps to blend these buildings in with the rest of my terrain collection, since they're all going to be sharing the same table. Then, of course, it's time to start painting. I pick out a few colors and start base coating both buildings all together since they have a lot of shared colors. While the walls will be different, the planks and timbers, the windows, and the rooftops, those will all be the same. When you're working with buildings like this, it's really important to keep in mind that you have to work with their strengths and weaknesses to get good results. For instance, all of the details like the wooden planks and bricks, they all have really rounded, bulky edges, so dry brushing isn't really going to work here. Edge highlighting would be a pain too. So I'm going to focus on other techniques that add texture, like stippling, washes, and weathering. The walls, for instance, get painted a solid color, then have a brighter version of that color stippled into the center of each panel. In that way, I can build up layers of texture and color that will work with what the buildings have going for them, rather than picking techniques like dry brushing, which would end up highlighting all of the flaws in the sculpt. While we get all of this base coating done, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for watching. I appreciate it. If you could take a moment to hit the like button, that would mean a lot to me. It genuinely helps small YouTube channels quite a bit. Right now, it is harder than ever to reach an audience on YouTube, and one of the best things you can do to help out small channels like mine is to share the video, hit like, or subscribe. But of course, there are those who go the extra mile. So I'd especially like to thank my Patreon supporters. Your continued support means so much, and I have some really cool exclusives that'll be coming up for you in the new year. Speaking of, I'd also like to remind everyone that I will be relaunching the channel in the new year with a new name, new logo, and all kinds of other goodies. Hopefully, I'll see you all there. Alright, enough of that, back to the project. It's time to start into those details I talked about earlier, the things that'll make these buildings pop a little. First, I want to get some color on all of these fruits and veggies in front of the general store. This is a great opportunity to tell the story of this building. Since it's long abandoned, I'm going to take some nasty grays, browns, and a moldy purple and wet blend them all over the fruits. This should look completely rotten and gross. A little environmental storytelling. Next up in the list of how to make things both more defined and more grimy is an oil wash. Now this is a mix of black and brown oil paints and white spirits. You can, of course, use a regular homemade acrylic wash for this, but oil paints are incredibly cheap in the long term, and they work way, way better. Seriously, I know there's a lot of hesitation for some of you to get into oils. I get that. It's one more thing to learn, one more skill you have to have. But I promise it's simple, cheap, and very effective. You can also do things with it that you can't as easily with acrylic washes. Here, for instance, I've mixed it a little thicker and darker than normal to really help dull down the colors and grime up the buildings. And here's where we land when the wash is dry. A big step forward, but we still have a lot of detail to add. And that starts with a second wash. Yeah. This one is acrylic though. This is just a homemade green wash that's going to go around the bottom of the buildings and get dabbed on the rooftops in a few places, as well as anywhere else it looks like moisture might collect and rot or plant life might grow. This is just the first layer of swampy plant matter we're going to add to this, and it does dry to be pretty subtle, but that's alright. It's really not about doing things in one great sweeping step. It's about lots of small layers of color and texture. To help add to that texture and to the swampy story we're telling, I take some muddy earth texture paste and use it to dot all around the bases, turning snowbanks into encroaching heaps of swamp mud instead. Delightful. Continuing to add to the visual storytelling, I decided the fruit piles at the general store just didn't look moldy and nasty enough, so I mixed up a bright green-yellow paint and some gloss medium, and I just kind of dotted on and make some drips and drizzles of nastiness out of the piles of fruit. It's been left out and abandoned so long that it's putrefying. Tiny as it is, I think this gross little touch ends up as my favorite bit of the finished building. Then it's finally time to do something about those rooftop snowbanks, and that something is going to be some nasty rot and algae and mold courtesy of our swamp setting. This is just a couple of different colors of flock, and a healthy dose of PVA glue mixed up together. This gets piled on abundantly all over the buildings. I do use it to cover up the snowdrifts on the roof, but it also goes a lot of other places. It can be used to cover up mistakes or spots you don't like, to add interest to boring areas, or just to bring in more nasty, swampy goodness over the entire build. And I liberally use it for all three. There are just a few tiny touches left, but as is usually the case with these kinds of projects, it's really the last few things that bring it all together. In this case, that's some nice swampy grass tufts to add yet more texture. I also go over all of the moss that I put down with a green-yellow dry brush to make it pop and add more dimension, and I even added some graffiti to the walls. Which leaves me with this for a final result. So there you go, a fun project and a great way to add to your terrain collection at a low price. Buildings like these are fantastic to practice your skills on and see how creative you can get around the limitations of the sculpt. Just as importantly, these buildings cost me an average of $7.50 a piece, which is pretty fantastic for this kind of terrain. During this time of year, these are easily found in thrift shops or even in clearance sections in many big box stores. So, happy hunting if you intend to give it a try. If you've ever done this before yourself, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how it turned out. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.